Just by way of a little bit of background, we're from Disaster Psychiatry Outreach. Sander and I and colleagues here in New York and in the United States have been responding to various types of disasters for a number of years. And so the material that you have that I'm going to present to you is based on our experience as well as our review of the scientific literature. And I'll hope that as I'm going along, you'll feel free to interrupt me with questions, and of course let me know if you can't hear me or understand me. Okay? Okay. Okay. So let's move on to the first slide, the overview, or actually we'll move past that to the question of what is disaster psychiatry, which is a subsequent slide. And if you keep going, you'll see a slide that says disaster psychiatry is the professional application of mental health knowledge and expertise to the setting of disasters. And the key information here is that what we're talking about is professional application of knowledge and expertise. And we emphasize that, even though it may not seem like a very sophisticated definition, only because at least in our experience, many people show up to disasters who do not, who mean well but do not have any real expertise in the area. So that's what we're trying to avoid. So if you move on to the next slide, you'll see that the subspecialties of disaster psychiatry. Disaster psychiatry encompasses so many different fields within psychiatry. And actually, I think that's what makes it interesting and also challenging. But it's emergency psychiatry, it's trauma psychiatry, it's community psychiatry, it's consult psychiatry, because you're often dealing in settings where there are medical issues. And at the bottom, the key part is that hopefully it's also there's something in there about preventative medicine, meaning that we hope that by intervening early, within days to weeks, of a trauma, and in this case of a disaster, that you can actually prevent long-term problems like PTSD and major depression from developing. That's the hope. We don't know scientifically whether that's all true just yet, but that's certainly the hope, and I think it makes intuitive sense. So if you move on to the next slide, a definition of what a disaster is. You're with me on the slides? Okay, so this is a good definition of a disaster. It's a trauma that overwhelms a community's ability to cope, and that's a good starting place. If you move on to the next slides, there's just some pictorial representations of what this means. The next slide depicts what stress is, and you'll see there, stress is basically, if you're thinking of a very strong wind. Or in this case, I think it's a hurricane that's being shown. Stress causes a tree to bend but not break, so that it has enough strength to it to withstand the forces. If you look at the next slide, trauma is stress that actually overwhelms the tree and causes something to break. And then if you move on to the next slide, a disaster is when multiple trees have broken. That's the idea that it's a trauma at a community level. And when you think about, if you move on to the next slide that talks about disaster characteristics, disasters are talked about through all sorts of different means. And the idea is if you talk about disasters from all these different perspectives, somehow you might get a better sense of the mental health impact. For example, the first item, natural versus man-made acts. And there's lots of discussion about whether natural versus man-made events cause more or less psychopathology. And many books will say that man-made acts cause more problems mental health-wise than natural acts. But in fact, there's really no consistent evidence to suggest that. different. It really all depends upon the particular disaster, in our opinion, and I think even in various aspects of the literature. There are so many different elements that go into how badly a given community or individual will suffer psychologically from a disaster. So earthquakes, there are plenty of examples of earthquakes in particular causing many years of psychiatric morbidity. I'm sorry?
Like in China.
Yeah, yes, absolutely. If you move on to the next slide, you're going to see just a discussion of different types of disasters. So this is a mention of biological terrorism. I'm just trying to give you an overview of how different disasters, their ramifications. You know, if you're dealing with a biological event, like the sarin gas attacks that occurred in Japan, I think in 1995, actually that was chemical, but if you deal with the biological attacks like we had the anthrax attacks here in New York in 2001, these are some of the issues, the psychological issues that would come up in that. Dealing with a novel agent, something that's invisible that you can't see, not knowing whether you're exposed, dealing with quarantine and isolation, which have very specific psychological effects, and even dealing with the potential for mass panic. Those would be some of the psychological issues you'd be dealing with in a biological event. If you move to the next slide, being more relevant to, of course, what you're dealing with right now, earthquakes, some of this specific psychological elements of an earthquake that make them particularly devastating and that they are not predictable. There's no warning. You don't see it. In a sense, you don't see what's causing the event. You know that there's something about tectonic plates shifting, but you don't actually see the cause. And then you're also dealing with the potential for aftershocks. And then all these things make earthquakes specific in terms of their psychological meaning for people. If you look at the next slide, am I going at an okay pace, by the way?
Yeah.
Okay. If you look at the next slide, this is just to look at another example of a disaster, and this is Hurricane Katrina, which, as you may know, struck the United States in, I guess it was 2006 in the southern part of the United States. And this is just an example of some of the problems that can be created from a natural disaster, even though it's not an earthquake. This Hurricane Katrina, it was studied, and this study was particularly unique. They looked at people about 6 months after the hurricane and then another year later, so 6 months and about 18 months later, and they saw increases in the rates of PTSD from around 15% to over 20% over that time. So the rates are actually increasing over time. And this is the only study that we know of that's actually taken a look at suicidality. And what they found was that suicidal thinking and suicidal planning actually increased over time in this community in the southern United States and the Gulf states. And this has actually never been demonstrated. People often talk about the possibility of suicidality after a disaster of any kind, but it's never really been captured scientifically until this study. And the very important additional finding in this study is what they found was what actually seemed to be causing these increases in PTSD and these increases in suicidal thinking was in fact stresses that followed from the hurricane, meaning where people were going to be living, how they were going to regain their jobs, how they were going to reconnect with their family. All the stresses of trying to get back into life seem to be contributing to these problems, not the actual initial impact of the hurricane. And I think that's a very important finding.